Wow, what a joy to have my friend, Jared Wilson. Jared's a prolific writer, a pastor, and his books and blogs have been read literally by tens of millions of people around the world. He loves to speak about love and to invest and give hope into people who are hurting. His latest book is called Love is Oxygen. It's awesome, and it discusses the impactful power of God's love and how pouring it into the world around you becomes as natural as breathing. Would you welcome with me, friends, Jared Wilson.
Thanks,
Hey, Jared.
Thank you.
So I'm so excited about your book, Love is Oxygen. And let's just begin with that. Why did you write this book?
Yeah, so one of the big things that I've struggled with all my life was depression and anxiety, and actually the first sentence of the book basically paints this picture of me sitting in my car Googling painless ways to commit suicide. And so my whole thing is that if the local church really wants to be the hope of the world, then the local church needs to step into situations in which people find themselves hopeless. And right now, a big one is depression and anxiety and PTSD and suicide. And so I wrote this book because I wanted people to know that you can still be a believer in Jesus, but still struggle with things as dark as depression and thoughts of suicide. And so that's where a lot of this came out of, was my personal story of encountering the love of Jesus. And then the rest of the book is then how I've seen the love of Jesus impact the lives of those around me.
Yeah, and the book really helps people find that oxygen, that life, that air that they need to get through anxiety, depression. It comes in waves, doesn't it?
Yeah.
To kind of like almost ride those things out, right?
Exactly. And for a lot of people, you know, prayer and worship and all these things will always be weapons that we use against darkness. But there's also a lot of people who are still struggling and still hurting. And so I paint, you know, this picture that people need to understand it's okay to admit that they're not okay. It's okay to admit that they're a believer in Jesus, but they still suffer, because the reality is that we're all humans and we all need the grace of Jesus.
I remember the evangelical university I went to really struggled, I think in the 60s, with starting a psychology department, because it was like, well, if we're Christians, do we really need psychology? Do we need medicine? Do we need these things? And so I think there's a shame thing when Christians struggle, but it's like over a third of Americans have anxiety or depression. And so, like, I remember on your Twitter, I think it was, you posted a picture of the medicine that you take for your, which I thought was like, whoa, that's really, because you're a pastor. And
correct.
Talk about that. I mean,
I want people to understand that it's okay to not be okay. It's okay to admit the things that they're going through. And the reality is that psychology and the message of Jesus and the teachings of Jesus work beautifully together. I believe with all my heart that the power of Jesus could fully free me from depression. It hasn't yet, but what it has done is it's given me the power to ignore the lies that depression tells me about myself. And so right now, God is continuing to give me the strength each and every day to ignore those things. But yeah, I'm fully open in admitting that I take antidepressants, and they're not for everybody, but just like you wouldn't tell someone who is dealing with diabetes not to take their diabetes medicine, or a girl who is dying of cancer not to take chemo, we have to understand that medication, although it is overly prescribed and a lot of people take advantage of it, it does help a lot of people.
Wow, wasn't he amazing? Pastor Jared was a pastor at an up-and-coming megachurch in Southern California, and I'm sure that a lot of you probably haven't even heard of him before. I hadn't until September 10th of this year. Day started out like any other day, came to work, unlocked my office, went, listened to the answering machine, checked my email messages, and then I always check my Facebook messages, because some people contact me for church things through Facebook. And as I was logging on to Facebook, I saw a story, and it said, Pastor Jared Wilson, advocate for mental health in the Christian community, commits suicide. And at that point, I lost it. I clicked on the link and I tried to find everything I could find about him. And I found what an amazing person he was, that struggled from depression most of his life and ended up getting married to a wonderful person who supported him in everything he did. They started a website called the Anthem of Hope, where people can go there, Christians can go there and get support. And they had 2 small sons that were now left fatherless. And I was crushed. And the tears were flowing down my face. At that same time, who would walk in the office but Pastor Dave coming to work? And, obviously he wondered, what is wrong? And I shared with him the story of a person who I never even knew that touched me so much. And we talked a long time about, why in churches we don't talk about mental illness. If 1 in 3 people suffer in their adult life with mental illness, obviously it's something that we should be addressing. And when I talk about mental illness, I'm talking about everything. I'm talking about depression, anxiety, postpartum stress disorder, multiple personality disorders, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, all of those things. And when I heard his story, I knew that it was something that we needed to talk about. So when Pastor asked me a month ago if I would be available to preach today, I'm sure he didn't have in mind that this is what I would want to talk about. And so before I go on, I really want to thank you, Pastor Dave, who I'm sure is watching this, for allowing me to talk about a subject that traditionally hasn't been talked about in church. And for you to allow me to do that, I can't tell you how grateful I am. So as I was searching through to try and find a text for today, I came across the one that Tom read about from 2 Kings. And just a general overview from that. Syria and Samaria were at war. And in those days, what would happen is that they would surround the village, surround the city, and people weren't allowed to go out and in. And because of that, famine took over. And people were dying because they had no food. And at the same time, outside the city were 4 lepers. And they were there because when in those days, if you had leprosy, you were feared, you were shunned, you were outcast. They did not want to be around you for a variety of reasons, one of which they thought it was very super contagious and they didn't want it themselves, which later we find out that leprosy isn't quite as contagious as what they thought. And the second reason being that they believed that if you had leprosy, it was probably because you had done some sin and God had caused that to be your cross to bear, and they didn't want to be surrounded by sinful people. So the lepers decided, you know what, we have a choice. We can either stay here and die of starvation, or we can go over to the Syrians and say, you know what, we surrender. If you take pity on us, give us food, give us water, then we stay alive. But if you decide not to have pity on us and kill us, then of course we die. But either way, the outcome would be the same. If we stay, we die. The worst that can happen if we leave would be death. So they go over, and as they're there, we hear that God caused a loud rumbling of chariots and it sounded like horses running, and they said that the ground even shook. Well, it scared them. It scared them right out of their city, out of their village. And so when the lepers got there, the tents were empty, and they went in and they ate and they drank wine and they took gold and silver. And after that, their conscience kind of set in, and they thought, you know what? We're here, we're happy, we're fed, but our people are still suffering. Our people are still dying because they're hungry, and we know where they can find food. So they made that conscious effort to go back and share the good news with the people of Samaria. Now, there are a lot of messages that can be taken from this text, one of which is nothing to lose. I mean, certainly the lepers had nothing to lose. If they stayed, they're going to die. The worst that could happen if they left would be death. And in life, that is true with us too. Sometimes when we're at our lowest point is when we have the most clarity in our lives. And God always meets us at those low points in our life. So nothing to lose could have been a message. There's also a message of what I call the 3 Ds: desperation, discovery, and duty. And certainly in that text, I think we can find examples of all 3 of those. But when I read the text, I saw something very different. What I saw is if this story would have taken place in modern day today, those wouldn't have been 4 lepers on the outside. Those would have been 4 people with mental illness outside of our churches, outside of our schools, outside of our communities. Because just like the lepers, a lot of times people that struggle with mental illness are feared and they are outcast. So to me, it was like a normal correlation between the two. And the thing that made the text so interesting was the heroic part on the lepers of going back to Samaria and helping the same people which had hurt them. So I want to share, thanks for bringing that up. It's called the gift of going second. You know, where do we go from here? If we would have played Jared's video a little bit longer, we would have heard his talk on the gift of going second. And basically what this means is that, you know, here in the United States, being first is so important. Being number one, being on top. But sometimes being first is scary, especially for people that struggle with mental illness, that they don't want to share their story because they are fearful of what will happen in the reaction. So the gift of going second means you sharing your story with someone, and then in doing that, you give them the gift to go second. An example of that, I think a lot of you know, I've been very open with this. I've struggled with depression my whole life. I can't really remember a time, even at my littlest, not having something that would make me think that I didn't have depression, even when I was really, really little. But when I was in my early 20s, sorry, getting a cold. When I was in my early 20s, I had just graduated from college, got my first teaching job, was engaged to be married. That's when it all really came to a head for me. And I knew that it wasn't just the normal lows of life, that this was something deeper than that. And I remember I lived in Titonka with my sister, and I would drive to Clear Lake to teach. And I remember there were days during a period where I could 2 or 3 or 4 times just break down and sob on my way to work. And one day in particular, I was teaching, and it was almost like a panic attack. I wanted to be out. I didn't want to be where I was. I didn't know where I wanted to be, but I didn't want to be there. And I remember walking down the hall because I knew if anybody could help me, it was my mom. And she was at work, and imagine getting this call. But I remember walking down the hall because in those days, 20-some years ago, we didn't have phones in every classroom, and we didn't have cell phones like we do now. And so I walked down to a room that I knew had a phone, and I called her, and I said, I don't know what to do. I don't want to go back. I don't know where I want to be. I just don't want to be here. And she talked me down like I knew she would. And as soon as I hung up the phone, I called my doctor, who was in Mason City, and I said, I need to get in and I need to be seen today. And we talked for a long time. She reaffirmed what I knew a long time, that yes, I did have some pretty bad depression. There was probably a chemical imbalance, and she started me on antidepressants. And I've been on them ever since that day, with the exception of having kids, which is a whole nother story, but I did stop while I was pregnant. That day when I was leaving, a teacher saw me and knew that I wasn't well. And the next day she came up and, wondered if everything was okay, and I shared with her my story about what had happened. And she, was very comforting to me, said if there's anything she could do, she would be there. Fast forward a few months, same teacher comes back to me and says, you know what? When you were talking to me and sharing your story, I was checking those things off in my head. Yep, I feel exactly the same way. And she had been struggling with the same type of thing that I did. And she said, if you had not shared your story with me, I would not have gone to the doctor and gotten on medication myself. And because of that, now I'm leading a happier life. The gift of going second, allowing yourself to be vulnerable so that you can help other people. Now, this isn't a new thing out there. If you really think about it, the gift of going second was way back with Jesus. I mean, Jesus experienced many hard times, many trials, many tribulations, and I think we could probably even make that argument that at some times he was downright depressed. He has been there. He knows what you're going through. He's shared it with you in the Bible. He's allowing you that gift of going second and opening himself up for you to pray. But he's also opening up other avenues for you in getting help, whether it be through medication or whether it be through counseling or whether it is going to see a member of your clergy. And the most important one is probably he died first. He died on the cross so that when we die second, we have eternal life in heaven. So if you're sitting there and you're thinking, oh, I think this message might be about, why do people struggle with depression and some people don't? Or why as a community and why as the Christian community, why don't we address mental illness like we should? And that's for another day. And maybe Pastor Dave at some point will talk about that. But what I want you to know is that what Jared said in the video is so true, that I know that God has the power to heal my depression. Absolutely has the power to heal my depression. Hasn't done it yet, but could do it. In fact, I don't even think there was a day in my life where I asked God to take away my depression. I have asked him to help me be stronger, to help me give me strength. And if the time comes where that I'm not going to be healed from that, thank you, that to use my illness as a way to help others. Like I said, I've always been open. I think that being open with people is the way to go. And a lot of you know that our daughter struggles with general anxiety disorder and has been recently diagnosed with depression herself. And we've raised her that it's okay to talk about it. That's part of who she is. And I know that she is going to change people's lives because of what she goes through on a daily basis. And if you don't struggle from mental illness, consider yourself very lucky because, like they said, 1 in 3 adults will have some type of mental illness in their life. But please be open and accepting to those people around you. Just like those lepers went back to Samaria and shared the good news, we need to be open and let people come in. And in them sharing their stories with us, it changes who we are as a church. And we can be more open and accepting to those people out there. The thing that it's done for me is that I started studying more about through the Anthem of Hope, and I knew something in me, I needed to do something. And through the Anthem of Hope, there is a place where you can go and you can take classes to be certified in QPR, which stands for Question, Persuade, and Refer. And last week I was supposed to be on vacation, but I spent most of my time doing the class, much to my children wanting me to be available to them at all times. But I took the course, and I am now certified as a gatekeeper for suicide prevention and also under the clergy part of that as well. So that if somebody would come in at their all-time low or have a family member that has committed suicide, I'm going to be better able to help them and counsel them. I have been at a therapy session with a child who, when asked if they've ever considered suicide and knew how they would do it, and the answer was yes. I know what people go through, and I know what parents feel, and I knew that if there was a way that I could help other people, I needed to do that. And so Pastor Dave really wanted me to reinforce this with you all, that our doors are open for you no matter what. That if we're in our offices, we're here to speak with you about anything. And our phones are always on. We're just a call away. But more importantly, I guess it really doesn't matter if the whole Christian community out there isn't talking about mental illness, because this church will. And that gives me hope. Amen.